After losing the use of his legs in a devastating accident, Brian's life fell apart when Mari, his wife, forged his signatures to steal everything he owned and threw him out of their home. Left with no resources and no direction, he found shelter and support in Linda, his housekeeper, who risked everything to help him. But the path they took together uncovered unexpected challenges, cruel betrayals, and an intense fight for justice that would change their lives forever. Brian Carter was known throughout Charlotte for his unmatched talent in fixing cars. His name was associated not only with impeccable service, but also with a genuine love for what he did. At 35, he ran Carter Motors, a garage he had built with his own hands, piece by piece. The customers who frequented the shop were not just clients, they were friends, many of them charmed by the sparkle in Brian's eyes when he talked about engines, suspensions, or any part of a vehicle that needed attention. The garage, located on a busy corner in the South End neighborhood, was a reflection of Brian's personality, organized, vibrant, and full of life. He had invested everything in it, even the weekends and evenings he could have spent with his wife, Mari. "She understands," he would often justify to his friends. "This is our future." Mari, with her long black hair and striking presence, knew how to turn heads. Always impeccably dressed, she seemed out of place at the garage, but made a point to stop by occasionally, bringing coffee or simply watching Brian with an enigmatic gaze. Despite the smile she wore in public, there was something in her demeanor that betrayed impatience, as if she were waiting for something more glamorous than life with a mechanic. Still, Brian adored her. Married for 7 years, he believed Mari was his life partner, the balancing force that helped keep him grounded. She managed the finances and the household, while he immersed himself in the world of cars. He never questioned her honesty or intentions. To Brian, Mari was the person he could count on, even when the days at the garage became exhausting. It was an ordinary morning when everything changed. The sky was clear and Brian was driving southbound on I-77, testing a sports car he had repaired for a client. He loved these moments. Feeling the engine pulse under his command was almost therapeutic. What he didn't know was that this drive would be the last he'd ever take on his own 2 legs. An out-of-control truck came out of nowhere. The impact was brutal. Shattered glass, twisted metal, and an overwhelming silence. When Brian opened his eyes in the hospital days later, the first thing he felt was absence. It wasn't just the physical pain, though it was intense, but the absence of something greater, the movement in his legs. The doctor, with a grave tone, explained that his spinal injury was severe, and the chances of recovery were minimal. Brian crumbled inside but tried to maintain his composure. He believed Mari would be his pillar of strength. "She'll stand by me, no matter what," he thought. Returning home, everything felt different. The house he and Mari had decorated together now felt cold, almost as if he were a stranger there. Mari greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was as impeccable as ever, but her demeanor was distant. During the first few days, Brian tried to overlook the nuances. Maybe it was the shock, perhaps the burden of caring for someone in a wheelchair. He blamed himself for being a burden. "I'll do my best to adapt, Mari," he said one evening, trying to reassure her. She just nodded, fiddling with her phone. Brian noticed that Mari spent hours on calls and seemed increasingly impatient with him. Yet, the signs were too subtle to ignore. Certain items began to disappear from the house, like the expensive watch Brian had given Mari for her birthday. Documents he always kept in his office were out of place, and above all, her gaze seemed to hold something he couldn't identify. Was it concern or disdain? One afternoon, while sitting alone in the living room, he overheard Mari on the phone, her voice low but laced with impatience. "Yes, he's here." "No, not yet. I told you I'll handle it soon. Calm down." When Brian later asked who it was, Mari replied quickly, "Work stuff, don't worry about it." Brian wanted to believe her, but something inside him wasn't convinced. He began to feel increasingly isolated in his own home. The love he once felt seemed to transform into doubts, but he still couldn't imagine what was really coming. As Brian struggled to adapt to his new life, he realized Mari was hiding something. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to investigate further, even as their relationship continued to unravel, suggesting that Mari's betrayal was on the verge of being exposed. Days at home had become a constant battle for Brian. Tasks that once seemed simple, like reaching for an item on a shelf or stepping over a small ledge, now required effort, patience, and often help. He hated depending on Mari for everything. Each time she helped him transfer from his wheelchair to the couch, he felt the weight of his own helplessness. Worse still, he noticed that Mari did it without enthusiasm, almost as if it were a draining obligation. At first, she tried to hide her frustration. "We'll get through this together, Brian," she would say, but the words felt hollow, lacking the warmth he used to hear in her voice. As the weeks passed, the facade of understanding fell away. What had once been stifled sighs turned into complaints. "You need to be more independent, Brian. I can't do everything by myself." He tried. He always tried. But his new reality was a maze of limitations. The physical therapy sessions he started demanded more from him than he had imagined. It was like relearning how to be human, and every day it seemed like the world around him shrank. The garage, the place where he had felt most alive, now seemed like a distant memory. The wheelchair didn't just trap his body, it confined his soul. He felt the distance between him and Mari growing, a chasm he didn't know how to bridge. The only person who seemed to truly notice his suffering was Linda. Quiet and unassuming, she continued her duties as their housekeeper, but always with a watchful eye. Linda was a middle-aged woman with a face marked by time but kind eyes that conveyed calm. Unlike Mari, she didn't look away when she saw Brian struggling with something. She would wait patiently until he asked for help, never making him feel like a burden. One morning, while Mari was out, Brian was unsuccessfully trying to open a can of food in the kitchen. Linda, passing by, hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Can I help you, Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. He nodded, defeated. "Thank you, Linda. It seems even the simplest things are a challenge now." She didn't reply immediately, but as she easily opened the can, she said, "Challenges show us how strong we can be. And you are strong, even if you don't see it yet." Those words, simple but sincere, moved him more than he cared to admit. It was the first time since the accident that someone had made him feel like more than a burden. As Brian began to see Linda as a source of quiet support, Mari became even more distant. Her constant time on the phone, already noticeable, grew more blatant. Whenever Brian tried to talk, she was either busy texting or heading out without much explanation. When he asked where she was going, her answers were vague. "Business," she would say impatiently. "You don't need to worry about it." Small details began to surface, fueling a growing unease in Brian. The household bills, which had always been paid promptly, started falling behind. He discovered this by chance when a notification for a power disconnection arrived. When he confronted Mari, she reacted irritably. "Do you think it's easy handling everything alone? I'm already doing more than I can." That response unsettled him. Mari had always been meticulous with finances, but now she seemed distracted, almost negligent. On top of that, Brian began to notice missing items around the house. Watches, jewelry, even a small sculpture he had bought during their honeymoon had disappeared without explanation. "Maybe she's selling things to help cover expenses," he thought, trying to rationalize it. But something in her behavior suggested there was more to it. The breaking point came one afternoon when Brian, trying to distract himself, asked Linda to help him sort through some old bills he kept in a drawer in his office. As they opened the drawer, he noticed that some documents were out of place. Contracts from the garage and even the title to the house were not where he remembered leaving them. "That's odd," he murmured. Linda glanced at him cautiously but said nothing, simply helping him organize the papers. Later that evening, Brian tried to bring up the subject with Mari. "Did you move any documents from the drawer? Some things aren't where they should be." Mari was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. She looked up at him with irritation. "I don't know what you're talking about, Brian. Maybe you forgot where you put them." He didn't want to push the issue, but her cold response only deepened his suspicion. Something was wrong. He knew it. And for the first time, he began to question whether Mari was truly on his side or if she had other plans. Brian woke that morning with an unshakable sense of unease. Mari had already left, as she did almost every day lately, leaving him alone in the house. Determined to use the time to re-examine the documents, he went to the office trying to understand why some of them were out of place. Something didn't add up, and he needed answers. As he sifted through the old folders, something caught his eye. Among the papers, he found a copy of the ownership contract for Carter Motors. The document, which should have been intact with his original signature, now showed alterations. Upon closer inspection, he realized the owner's name had been changed. It was no longer Brian Carter, but Mary Carter. Most shocking of all was seeing his own signature at the bottom of the document, a signature he knew he had never written. His heart pounded. Shock and disbelief momentarily paralyzed him. He tried convincing himself he was mistaken, but the evidence was there, in ink and paper. Mary had forged his signature and transferred ownership of the garage, his life's work, into her name. He called Mary immediately, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. "Mary, what is this? Why is the garage contract in your name? Did you mess with the documents?" On the other end, Mary's tone was cold and matter-of-fact. "I did what needed to be done, Brian. You'd better accept it." Brian felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. "Accept it? What does that even mean? Why would you do this?" Mary sighed, clearly irritated. "Don't you get it? Look at yourself. You're not the man you used to be. You can't work, you can't support this house, and you certainly can't keep the garage running. I'm just securing the future because it's obvious you can't." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. "Securing the future? By stealing everything I've built? This is theft, Mary." "Theft?" Mary snapped, her voice rising. "Theft is what you're doing to me, dragging me into this miserable life. Do you really think I'm going to spend the rest of my days taking care of someone who can't even stand on their own? I deserve better than this, Brian." Shock gave way to fury. "You're abandoning me because I'm in a wheelchair? Is that what this is about?" "It's not just that," she replied icily. "I've already made my decision. I want you out of my house. I'll have a lawyer make it official. Do whatever you want, but know this. We're done." The call ended abruptly, leaving Brian sitting in his chair, staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. He had known Mary to be impatient, even selfish at times, but he never imagined she was capable of such cruelty. Despair began to creep in as he tried to fathom what he would do without the garage, his home, or anything else. Hours later, Mary returned home with two men Brian didn't recognize. Without ceremony, she announced, "They're here to move your things out. You have until tomorrow to leave." "You're kicking me out of my own house?" Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. "This house is mine now. The papers are in my name. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." Brian watched, helpless, as the men carried his belongings outside. He tried to argue, to plead, even to threaten, but nothing worked. Mary had already made up her mind. Within hours, all he had left was a suitcase with some clothes and his wheelchair. That night, Brian sat on the sidewalk in front of the house, staring into the void. The humiliation was unbearable. Not only had he lost his independence, but now his dignity was gone too. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The cold night air seeped into his bones, but he was too numb to care. It was then that Linda appeared. She had spent the day cleaning the house and had silently witnessed everything without intervening. Now seeing Brian alone on the street, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, stopping beside him. "Come with me. You can't stay here." He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with shame. "I have nowhere to go, Linda." "Then come to my house. It's not much, but it's a roof over your head. Please." Brian hesitated, but the kindness in her eyes convinced him. He didn't have enough pride left to refuse. Linda helped him into a cab, and a short while later they arrived at her home in the suburbs, a modest but welcoming place. Linda prepared a hot bowl of soup and insisted he eat. Though he had no appetite, Brian realized it was the first time in weeks that someone genuinely cared about him. That night, as he lay on the small couch in Linda's living room, the weight of his new reality bore down on him. He was no longer just a man in a wheelchair. He was a man without a home, a job, or hope. All he had now was the uncertainty of the future and the bitter sting of betrayal. Brian's first morning at Linda's house was a challenge, not just because of the modest conditions, but because of the crushing reality that was settling deeper into his mind. The small living room where he now slept was tidy but humble, a worn-out sofa, curtains that didn't fully block the sunlight, and furniture that had clearly been passed down through generations. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen offered temporary relief, but the weight of his situation clung to him. He had nothing left, no house, no garage, not even respect for himself. The humiliation was a weight that kept him motionless, even when his wheelchair was within reach. Linda appeared at the doorway holding a cup of coffee and offering a timid smile. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I brought you some coffee. I know you like it strong." Brian accepted the cup, but couldn't meet her gaze. "Thank you, Linda, but you don't have to do this. You've already done more than enough by taking me in. I shouldn't be bothering you." "You're not a bother," she replied firmly. "I couldn't leave you on the street, not after everything you've been through." He wanted to believe her words, but shame gnawed at him. The idea of being a burden to Linda, a woman who already had so little, made his throat tighten. Still, he knew he had no other choice. Not right now. Over the next few days, Linda did everything she could to make things easier for him. She rearranged the furniture to accommodate his wheelchair and prepared simple yet nourishing meals with what little she had. In return, Brian tried to help in small ways, washing dishes, organizing kitchen utensils, and occasionally offering advice on how to fix things around the house. These small tasks were the only things that gave him a fleeting sense of usefulness. Yet the humiliation continued to haunt him. He often found himself staring out the window for hours, lost in thoughts about how his life had unraveled so quickly. The accident had already been a devastating blow, but Mari's betrayal had shattered him completely. He had trusted her, shared his dreams with her, and believed she would stand by him during the toughest moments. Instead, she had discarded him like something worthless. One evening after dinner, Linda pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "Can I ask you something?" she began hesitantly. Brian looked up, his eyes weary. "Of course. Do you think it's over? I mean, your life, your dreams. Do you believe there's no way forward?" The question caught him off guard. He was silent for a moment before responding, his voice heavy with sadness. "I don't know, Linda. It feels like everything I worked for has been taken from me. I don't see how I can start over, especially like this, stuck in this chair." Linda frowned, clearly disagreeing. "Stuck? I don't think you're stuck. Your mind is still the same. Your heart is still the same. It might be hard now, but I believe you'll find a way." Her words were simple but carried a sincerity that Brian wasn't used to hearing. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, something that felt like hope, though he didn't dare name it yet. As the bond between them began to deepen, Mary finally discovered where Brian was staying. One afternoon, Linda returned from the market with bags in hand and found Mary standing in front of her door. Mary, impeccably dressed as always, looked completely out of place in the modest neighborhood. Her eyes were filled with disdain as she glared at Linda. "You've got some nerve, don't you?" Mary said without preamble. Linda, surprised but calm, replied, "What are you talking about? Helping Brian? Bringing him here, knowing full well he has nothing to offer? Do you really think you're being noble?" Linda held her gaze, unwavering. "I did what any decent person would do. He needed help." Mary let out a bitter laugh. "Decent? That's funny coming from someone like you, a housekeeper living in this pathetic place. You're nobody, Linda, and helping Brian is only going to drag you down further." "Maybe I'm nobody to you," Linda said, her voice steady but controlled. "But I care about people, something you clearly don't know how to do." Mary fell silent for a moment, visibly caught off guard by Linda's defiance. Then, with a cold smile, she said, "Well, you're fired. I don't need someone who interferes in my life." Linda felt the sting of those words but didn't let it show. She simply lifted her chin. "If that's what you want, so be it. But what you did to Brian, it will come back to you, Mary." Without replying, Mary turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Linda stood there for a moment, feeling the gravity of her new situation. Losing her job meant losing her only source of income, but she didn't regret her decision. She couldn't abandon Brian. Later that day, Brian noticed something different about Linda. She seemed distracted, quieter than usual. Finally, he asked, "Did something happen?" She hesitated but eventually told him, "Mari fired me. She came here today. She found out you're staying with me." The news hit Brian like a punch. He felt even more miserable, blaming himself for bringing trouble to the one person who had shown him kindness. "Linda, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I weren't here, you wouldn't have lost your job." She shook her head, cutting him off. "Stop that, Brian. I made the choice to help you, and I don't regret it. Losing that job isn't the end of the world. I'll figure something out." But Brian couldn't accept it so easily. He knew how much that job meant to her, especially given her living situation. He wanted to help her, but he had nothing to offer. He felt like a weight, a burden that ruined everything he touched. That night, while Linda slept, Brian lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Guilt and shame consumed him, but so did something else. Linda's words echoed in his mind. Your mind is still the same. Your heart is still the same. He knew he was at rock bottom, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to climb back up. Looking out the small living room window, Brian decided he had to find a way to repay Linda. She had sacrificed so much for him, and he couldn't keep living as a shadow of himself. He didn't know how yet, but he would do whatever it took to help her, just as she had helped him. It was the least he owed her, and himself. Days passed slowly in Linda's modest home, but she and Brian had settled into a routine that brought a semblance of stability to the chaos of their lives. Brian still carried the guilt of Linda losing her job for helping him, but she made a point to deflect the focus, maintaining her optimism. He knew that behind her quiet strength were financial worries and uncertainties, but Linda never let them show. One ordinary afternoon, Linda walked through the door with an expression of surprise and relief. Brian could tell something significant had happened. She sat down beside him, holding an envelope, and took a deep breath before beginning. "I got a letter today, Brian, from my great-aunt Martha." He frowned. "Great-aunt? I don't remember you ever mentioning her." Linda nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "She was a recluse, lived in a small town about 2 hours from here. We were never close, but apparently, well, she left me something, a house." Brian blinked, surprised. "A house? What do you mean?" "I didn't know either. It was a shock," Linda continued. "She passed away a few months ago, and the paperwork just got finalized. From what I understand, it's a small, simple house. It's not worth much, but it's something." Brian processed the information for a moment, but before he could respond, Linda's voice took on a tone of determination. "I want to sell the house, Brian." "Sell it?" He looked confused. "Why?" Linda met his gaze, her expression serious. "To pay for treatment for you. You need a real chance to recover your mobility, and we need to fight Mari in court. That money could make both happen." Brian shook his head almost immediately. "Linda, no, that's crazy. This house is yours. It's your security, your future. I can't let you sacrifice that for me." She took his hands, her eyes steady. "Brian, listen. I don't need a house in another town. What I need is to see you get back on your feet. You deserve a second chance, and if this money can help bring that, then I'm doing it." He tried to protest again, but Linda didn't relent. "If you want to repay me in any way, Brian, then fight for yourself. Accept my help. Make it worth something." Her conviction left him speechless. Brian felt a mix of gratitude and discomfort. Part of him wanted to refuse, to insist that she didn't need to do this, but another part of him knew she was right. He needed help, and this could be the opportunity to turn the tables on Mari and the cruel fate that seemed to have beaten him down. After a long pause, Brian finally nodded. "If this is what you want, then let's do it together." Linda's smile was genuine and warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Brian felt a small glimmer of something he hadn't in a long time: hope. In the days that followed, the two began planning. Linda contacted a real estate agent in the neighboring town, who confirmed that the house could be sold quickly, even if the price wouldn't be high. Meanwhile, Brian started researching clinics specializing in spinal injury treatments. He found one that used an innovative technique, though the costs were steep. Still, he couldn't deny that the success stories from other patients reignited his will to try. Linda, in turn, began looking for lawyers who could help them challenge the fraudulent documents Mari had used to take Brian's garage and house. Legal fees were also significant, but she believed that with the money from the house sale, they could get started. In the evenings, after long days of planning, Brian and Linda often sat together in the small living room discussing their next steps. These conversations brought an unexpected closeness. Linda, ever practical and optimistic, challenged Brian to think beyond his physical limitations, while he, in turn, encouraged her to dream bigger and believe that her kindness could take her further than she thought. One day, as they were reviewing paperwork and budgets, Linda paused and looked at Brian. "You know this is going to be hard, don't you? Both the treatment and the lawsuit, it's going to take everything we have." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'll admit I'm scared of failing. But if there's one thing you've taught me, Linda, it's that I can't let that fear stop me." She smiled. "That's right. Fear is just another obstacle, Brian, and obstacles can be overcome." Not long after, Linda sold the house. The proceeds, though modest, were enough to start Brian's treatment and cover the initial retainer for the lawyer they chose to hire. The attorney, an experienced man named Richard Maxwell, reviewed the documents and immediately recognized the gravity of Mari's fraud. "If we can prove the signature was forged, "We have a strong chance of reversing all this," he said confidently. As Brian began his first sessions at the clinic, Linda handled the paperwork and meetings with Richard. The treatment was grueling and demanding, pushing Brian to confront his physical and mental limits. There were moments when he wanted to give up, when the pain was unbearable, and progress felt non-existent. But every time he thought about quitting, he looked at Linda. The determination in her eyes was enough to keep him going. The bond between them, already strong, grew even deeper. It wasn't just gratitude that Brian felt for Linda. It was something more, something he couldn't quite put into words yet. Linda, for her part, began to realize that Brian meant more to her than just someone she had helped. But neither was ready to admit these feelings. Not yet. Not while so many battles still lay ahead. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of therapy, Brian looked at Linda and said, "I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't come into my life." She chuckled softly. "Probably not on my couch messing up my house." They both laughed, and for the first time in a long while, Brian felt something that resembled peace. As they moved forward with the lawsuit and treatment, a new energy seemed to fill their days. The journey was long and fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time since the accident, Brian felt that there might, just might, be a way back for him, a path he wouldn't have to walk alone. Hope was beginning to emerge, not just for Brian but for Linda as well, who saw in him the strength she had always known was there. Together, they were determined to face whatever came next, knowing that the real test was still to come. Selling Linda's great-aunt's house, which initially seemed straightforward, quickly proved to be more complicated than expected. The real estate agent had underestimated the property's condition and the challenges of finding buyers in a less desirable area. The process dragged on, and with no money coming in, the clinic bills and legal fees began piling up. "It'll work out," Linda said with quiet determination as she reviewed the real estate paperwork for the 5th time. Brian, however, couldn't hide his worry. He knew that each day without funds placed more strain on Linda, and it made him feel even more powerless. The wheelchair was already a constant reminder of his limitations, but watching Linda sacrifice so much for him only deepened his sense of failure. "I should be helping you, not the other way around," he confided one night, as Linda sorted through the small coffee table piled with bills. She looked at him, her eyes both soft and resolute. "You are helping, Brian. You're fighting, and that means everything." He wanted to believe her words, but doubt began to creep in, especially as the treatment proved to be more grueling than he'd anticipated. The clinic they had chosen was known for its innovative techniques, but progress was slow, and each session tested his physical and emotional limits. Daily physical therapy sessions were a mix of intense pain and exhaustion. Brian felt muscles that hadn't been used in months pushed to their limits, while the medical team encouraged him to keep going. He watched other patients progress faster than he did, and often wondered if it was all worth it. During one particularly difficult session, he collapsed onto the therapy table, sweat streaming down his face, and declared in frustration, "I can't do this. It's not working." The therapist, a patient but unyielding man, replied, "You won't see results overnight, Brian. This is a marathon, not a sprint." But the words weren't enough. When Linda came to pick him up later that day, she found him dejected, his eyes distant. On the way home, he finally opened up. "What if this doesn't work, Linda? What if I'm stuck in this chair forever? All your sacrifices, all this effort, it'll be for nothing." Linda stopped the car at a red light and turned to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "Don't say that. No sacrifice is for nothing, Brian. What matters is that you're trying. That's already a victory." "But what if I fail?" he pressed, his voice breaking. "Then you fail trying. And that's more than most people ever do. Don't stop now." Her words struck him deeply. Brian didn't respond, but he knew deep down that Linda was right. He couldn't give up, not for himself and not for her. As Brian fought through his treatment, his relationship with Linda began to change in subtle but undeniable ways. The two spent more time together, and their conversations, which had once focused on planning and strategy, now included stories from their pasts, dreams for the future, and occasional laughter. Linda shared childhood memories, speaking fondly of her great-aunt, an eccentric but kind woman who had always believed that true kindness was the greatest legacy one could leave behind. Brian, in turn, told stories from the garage, describing how every bolt tightened and every car repaired had been a way for him to feel alive. "It was my sanctuary," he admitted one evening. I could go there and forget about the world. Now, all I have are memories. Maybe one day you'll have something like that again, Linda replied with an encouraging smile. Maybe even something better. Brian laughed, but there was sincerity in his voice. You always know just what to say, don't you? Someone has to be the optimist around here, she teased, though her smile hid her own growing concerns. Despite the emotional progress they were making, real-world challenges continued to mount. Their attorney, Richard Maxwell, warned them that the case against Murray could drag on for months, possibly years, if she chose to contest the fraud accusations. Evidence was still being gathered, and even the smallest mistake could jeopardize the entire case. Meanwhile, Linda finally received an offer for the house, but it was significantly lower than expected. The real estate agent explained that market conditions were unfavorable, and though reluctant, Linda agreed to accept. The money would be enough to continue Brian's treatment and initiate the legal process, but there wouldn't be much left for emergencies. When the sale was finalized, they celebrated with a simple dinner at home. Linda insisted on cooking Brian's favorite dish, a homemade stew he had mentioned once. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally, filled with a warmth that could only come from two people who had learned to trust each other completely. The peace, however, was short-lived. A few days later, Linda had an unexpected encounter. She was at the local market buying essentials when a well-dressed woman she instantly recognized as one of Murray's friends approached her. The woman, with a calculated smile, spoke in a low voice. "Murray asked me to tell you to stay out of this. Helping Brian won't get you anywhere, it'll just drag you down with him." Linda tried to remain calm, though anger bubbled beneath the surface. "Tell Murray I'm not afraid of her," she replied, before turning on her heel and walking away. When she told Brian about the incident later, he looked visibly upset. "Murray's trying to intimidate you now. That's too much, Linda. I can't let her keep hurting you because of me." Linda placed her hand over his, a gesture that had become natural between them. "She can try, Brian, but I won't back down. Not now, not after everything we've been through. She knows she's losing and it's making her desperate." Her words were strong, but Brian knew how much Linda was risking for him. Fear for her safety grew within him, but alongside it something else began to take shape, a profound admiration, and perhaps something deeper he wasn't ready to name yet. The bond between them, forged through adversity, had become unbreakable. Still, the threat loomed. Murray wouldn't give up easily, and Brian knew the hardest days were yet to come. The slow progress of the legal case against Murray had not gone unnoticed by her. Although she maintained an outward appearance of control, Murray was becoming increasingly restless. The frequent legal notices and communications from Brian's lawyer, Richard Maxwell, began arriving more regularly. While Murray had always viewed Brian as incapable of standing up to her, it was now evident that he wasn't alone, and that deeply irritated her. In a bold move, Murray decided to confront Brian directly. One day, she showed up at the clinic where he was undergoing treatment. Brian was finishing an exhausting physical therapy session when he spotted her standing in the doorway, wearing her fake smile and the venomous expression he had come to recognize. "You seem busy," she remarked, crossing her arms as she glanced around. "But I have a feeling you're wasting your time." Brian stared at her, taking a deep breath to contain his anger. "What do you want, Murray?" She stepped forward, leaning slightly toward him. "I know what you're trying to do, Brian. This lawsuit. You think you can bring me down, make me pay? It's pathetic." He didn't respond immediately, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his rising fury. Finally, he spoke with forced calm. "I don't need you for anything, Murray. Not anymore. And you will pay for what you've done." Murray laughed, an empty, cruel sound. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you? I've taken everything from you once and I can do it again. But this time, maybe I'll go after the person helping you." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. A chill ran down Brian's spine as he realized what she was implying. "Linda has nothing to do with this. Leave her out of it." "Oh, but she has everything to do with it," Murray retorted, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You think she can save you? That this little woman can make any difference? She's just digging her own grave." Brian wanted to respond, but Murray turned and left before he could react. Her words hung in the air like poison, and an overwhelming sense of dread consumed him. His fear for Linda now overshadowed all else. Murray had already destroyed his life once. He knew what she was capable of. That evening, when Linda found out about the encounter, she saw Brian sitting on the couch, his head buried in his hands. He didn't need to say anything. His defeated posture said it all. "She came to you, didn't she?" Linda asked, sitting beside him. "What did she say?" Brian looked up, his eyes heavy with guilt and worry. "She threatened you, Linda. She said she might come after you if I keep pursuing the case." Linda took a deep breath, absorbing the information. "And you're thinking of giving up, aren't you?" Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of disappointment. "I can't let her hurt you," he said, his voice trembling. "I've already caused you so much trouble. If anything happened to you because of me—" Linda took his hands in hers, gripping them firmly. "Brian, listen to me. That's exactly what she wants. She wants to break you, to make you feel like it's not worth fighting. But you can't let her win. But what if she really does something to you? How could I live with myself knowing I was the reason?" Linda shook her head, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not afraid of her. Not now. Not after everything we've been through. You're not alone, Brian. We're in this together. And if we give up now, she wins. Is that what you want?" He looked away, struggling to hold back tears. I don't know if I'm strong enough." "Yes, you are," she said with conviction. "You've come this far. You survived an accident, betrayal and humiliation. You're still here, don't give up now." Her words were like a balm, but Brian still felt the crushing weight of the decision. That night was long, with him tossing and turning on the couch, wrestling with his fears and insecurities. He knew Linda was right, but the dilemma tore at him. Giving up would mean protecting Linda, but it would also mean abandoning any chance for justice. Continuing meant risking Linda's safety, but it also meant standing up for what was right. The next morning, Brian made his decision. When Linda woke up, she found him reviewing the lawyer's documents, something he hadn't done since the confrontation with Mari. "You're going to keep fighting?" she asked cautiously. He nodded. "Yes. I can't let her win, Linda. Not after everything." Her smile was one of relief and pride. "I knew you'd choose to fight." As they refocused on the case, Richard Maxwell brought unexpected news. He had managed to access old documents that could be used against Mari. Among them were records of fraudulent transactions she had conducted in the past, involving former business partners and even members of her own family. Additionally, forensic analysis of the forged signatures was nearly complete, and the experts were confident they could prove the fraud. When Linda and Brian heard the news, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time, it felt like they were making real progress, that Mari was on the verge of being exposed. The news gave Brian a renewed sense of energy and determination, while Linda felt that all their efforts were beginning to pay off. Still, they knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Mari wasn't one to back down easily, and the legal battle promised to be long and emotionally taxing. But for the first time, Brian felt like he had a real chance, and he knew that chance existed only because Linda was by his side. As they prepared for the next steps, the bond between them continued to deepen. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time the future seemed a little less daunting. On the horizon, there was the promise of justice, and perhaps something more. The courtroom was heavy with tension. On one side sat Brian, in his wheelchair, accompanied by Linda and Richard Maxwell, his confident and meticulous attorney. On the other side was Mari, as impeccably dressed as ever, with her own lawyer and an icy gaze masking the growing unease that each new piece of evidence brought against her. This trial was more than a legal dispute. It was an emotional battlefield where hidden truths and betrayals would be laid bare. Richard began the case with a clear and powerful opening statement, outlining how Mari had forged documents to seize Brian's assets, including his garage and home. He highlighted Brian's dedication to his work and how these assets were not just his livelihood, but his legacy. This man lost everything, not just because of a tragic accident, but because of the betrayal of the person he trusted most. The first wave of evidence was presented, the analysis of signatures on the documents. Experts testified that the signatures were unquestionably forged, pointing out subtle but definitive differences compared to Brian's genuine handwriting. The evidence was irrefutable, and Brian could see Mari shifting uncomfortably in her seat. When Mari was called to testify, she initially maintained her composure, denying the accusations and attempting to cast herself as a victim. She claimed she had assumed ownership of the assets out of necessity, arguing that Brian, in his debilitated condition, was incapable of managing them. "I did what I thought was best for both of us," she declared with feigned emotion. "I never meant to harm him." Richard, however, was unshaken. With surgical precision, he began dismantling Marie's lies. You want this court to believe you are acting in Mr. Carter's best interests, but what about the bank transactions showing funds being siphoned from the garage into your personal accounts? He displayed detailed statements revealing how Marie had drained the business's savings to fund her lavish lifestyle. The most damning moment came when Richard brought witnesses from Marie's past. A former business partner, visibly nervous, recounted how Marie had manipulated him and driven him into bankruptcy years ago. "She's a master of deceit," he said. "I lost everything because I trusted her." The final blow came when Richard presented emails exchanged between Marie and a lawyer shortly before Brian was evicted from his home. The messages clearly outlined her intent to take everything for herself, leaving Brian with nothing. As the emails were read aloud, Brian glanced at Marie, searching for any hint of remorse. All he saw was the same cold, empty stare that had haunted him since the day she betrayed him. The judge, his expression stern, interrupted the proceedings. "Mrs. Carter, the evidence presented paints a clear pattern of manipulative and fraudulent behavior. This court cannot ignore the severity of the allegations." When it was Brian's turn to testify, he spoke with raw honesty and emotion. He described his passion for his garage, how he had built everything from scratch, and how the accident had already taken so much from him. "I could have faced anything, even my new reality, but Marie's betrayal, that was the hardest blow. She didn't just take my possessions, she tried to steal my dignity." Brian's words resonated deeply with the jury and everyone in the courtroom. Even Marie's attorney seemed uncomfortable, as if realizing the futility of defending her actions. The verdict was clear. The court ruled in Brian's favor, nullifying the fraudulent documents and returning all his assets to him. Moreover, Marie was found guilty of forgery and financial fraud, facing heavy fines and a prison sentence. As the judge delivered the sentence, Brian felt a wave of relief and emotion wash over him. He looked at Linda, who was holding his hand tightly, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. For the first time in months, he felt like he was regaining not only what was his but also his dignity and the ability to move forward. Marie, on the other hand, left the courtroom with her shoulders slumped, her arrogance shattered. She glanced at Brian for a brief moment, but he looked away. There was nothing left to say. The courtroom victory marked the beginning of a new chapter for Brian. With the garage back in his name, he started planning its reopening. Though he knew it would take time to rebuild the business, he was determined to make it a symbol of his resilience. At the same time, progress in his treatment began to show. After months of pain and effort, Brian managed to wiggle his toes. The small movement was met with cheers from the medical team and Linda, who as always was by his side. "I told you you'd do it," she said, smiling. Brian looked at her, overwhelmed with gratitude that went beyond words. "I couldn't have done it without you, Linda. You never gave up on me even when I wanted to give up on myself." With his assets restored and the first signs of physical recovery, Brian felt he was finally leaving the worst behind. But deep down, he knew that the greatest victory wasn't against Marie or even his physical limitations. It was rediscovering his ability to trust, to fight, and above all, to love again. As he looked at Linda, he knew his future wouldn't be faced alone. Carter Motors, once empty and silent, began to come alive again. With Linda's help, Brian spent weeks cleaning the space, reorganizing tools, and reactivating machinery that had sat idle for months. Although the wheelchair remained a constant presence, Brian refused to let it limit him. With the adaptations Linda had helped implement, he managed to get back to working on engines and parts, rediscovering the enthusiasm that he had once thought lost. The first customers to return to the garage were longtime friends and loyal patrons who, upon hearing about Brian's court victory, came back to show their support. Every car that rolled through the doors was a small triumph, a step toward the full recovery of not just the business but Brian's spirit. As he looked around, pride and gratitude filled him. He knew this revival wouldn't have been possible without Linda. Linda was more involved than ever, managing the administration and even learning some basic mechanics. "Never thought I'd end up fixing cars," she joked, holding a wrench. Brian laughed, marveling at her ability to turn any task into something positive and fun. As they rebuilt the garage, Brian had an idea that sent them in an exciting new direction. During his physical therapy sessions, he had met others with physical disabilities who faced tremendous barriers to regaining normalcy in their lives. He began to think about how he could use his garage to help these people. "Linda," he said one evening, as they discussed expansion plans, "what if we dedicate part of the garage to modifying cars for people with disabilities? Adjusting pedals, controls, seats, anything to make life easier for them." Linda's face lit up with a smile. "That's an amazing idea, Brian. You wouldn't just be rebuilding your life, you'd be helping others rebuild theirs too." The idea quickly became a reality. Brian dedicated a section of the garage exclusively to this purpose, creating a specialized area for adapting vehicles. He connected with other professionals and experts to better understand the specific needs of his clients, while Linda spearheaded the outreach efforts, designing campaigns to attract people who could benefit from the new services. The transformation of the garage was a success. Soon customers began arriving from across the city and even neighboring areas. Parents brought cars to be modified for their children with mobility challenges, and war veterans sought adaptations that would allow them to drive again. Each story was unique, and every completed modification reminded Brian that he was on the right path. Despite their achievements, Brian and Linda didn't forget the hardships they had endured. Sometimes, in the quiet moments at the garage, Brian reflected on how the accident and Mari's betrayal had reshaped his life. He had lost so much, but he had also gained something unexpected, a deeper purpose and a love that had grown steadily, quietly, yet powerfully. One evening, as they sat on the steps of the garage, exhausted after a long day of work, Brian broke the silence. "Linda, you know how much you mean to me, don't you?" She turned to him, surprised, but with a soft smile. "I think so. I wouldn't be here without you," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my life. You gave me something to fight for, something to believe in. I know I'll never be able to repay everything you've done, but I want to try." Linda took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've already done that, Brian. Just seeing you stand back up, figuratively and someday literally, means more than you know." Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "Figuratively for now, but you'll see. I'll walk again. And when I do, the first thing I want to do is dance with you." Linda blushed slightly but held his gaze. "I'll hold you to that dance." The conversation fell into a comfortable silence, but the weight of their words lingered in the air. Brian knew that his connection with Linda was more than just a partnership. It was something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. The next day, while they were reviewing plans to expand the garage's services, Brian made a new proposal. "Linda, I don't want you to just be my partner in running the business. I want you to be my partner in everything, in life, in work, in whatever comes next." She stared at him surprised, but her eyes softened quickly. "Are you sure about this, Brian? Because I never thought I was more than someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time." He held her hand firmly, looking straight into her eyes. "You're so much more than that, Linda. You're the person who believed in me when no one else did. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Then I guess we're in this together, Carter." In the months that followed, they continued transforming the garage into something far greater than a business. It became a place of hope and renewal, where every customer left not just with a modified car, but with a new perspective on life. At the center of it all were Brian and Linda, united by a love that had triumphed over the harshest of trials. Brian knew his journey wasn't over. There was still much to rebuild, both in the garage and in his personal life. But with Linda by his side, he felt ready to face anything. Together, they were turning the pain of the past into a solid foundation for a brighter future. The morning was clear and sunny, as if the sky itself recognized the significance of the day. Carter Motors, now fully renovated, stood ready for its grand reopening. Years of hard work and the adversities faced by Brian and Linda had led to this moment. The freshly painted sign at the entrance gleamed in the sunlight, symbolizing not just the name of the shop, but also the determination and resilience that had brought them to this point. Friends, old customers, and new members of the community began gathering outside. Brian, in his wheelchair, sat beside Linda under an arch of blue and white balloons decorating the entrance. The ceremony was modest, but deeply meaningful. Everyone present knew this was more than just a garage reopening. It was a beacon of resilience, perseverance, and new beginnings. "Thank you all for being here today," Brian began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He looked out at the small crowd and continued. "This garage was where I found my passion, where I built my life and where I thought I'd lost everything. But life has a funny way of surprising us. Even when everything seems lost, sometimes we find a strength we didn't know we had." He paused, his gaze turning to Linda. "And sometimes we find someone who believes in us when we've stopped believing in ourselves. For me, that person was Linda. She not only helped me get this garage back, but also gave me something even greater: hope." The applause was immediate and heartfelt, but Brian wasn't finished. "Today, this garage isn't just a place to fix cars. It's a place to fix lives, to help those who, like me, have faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. And that's only possible because I didn't give up, and because Linda never let me." Linda stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes as she took the microphone. "I just did what anyone should do, see the potential in someone and help them find it again. Brian, you are living proof that love, kindness, and determination can overcome even the hardest obstacles." With a smile, Brian cut the symbolic ribbon marking the official reopening of the garage. Applause echoed as guests began exploring the revamped space, now split between a traditional repair shop and a dedicated section for adapting vehicles for people with disabilities. Later, as the crowd thinned, Brian called Linda into the shop. The space, once just a workplace, now exuded warmth, with vibrant colors and motivational messages adorning the walls. A central ramp allowed Brian to move freely in his wheelchair. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a small area in the back. Covered by a cloth was something he had been working on for weeks. With a firm pull, Brian revealed a framed display featuring an old photo of the garage next to a recent one of him and Linda standing under the new sign. Above the images were the words, "Past and Future, a place of new beginnings." "This is for us," he explained, "to remind us where we started and where we're going." Linda looked at him, tears streaming freely. "It's beautiful, Brian. Thank you." But the most memorable moment of the day was still to come. As the two spoke about future plans, Brian turned to Linda with a determined look. "I have a promise to keep," he said, referencing the vow he'd made months earlier. With effort, and supported by Linda and his cane, Brian stood up. The garage was empty, but for him it felt like the grandest stage. He took one step, then another, each movement deliberate and meaningful. When he finally looked at Linda, her face glowed with pride and joy. "It's not quite a dance," he joked, still steadying himself, "but it's a start." Linda laughed, holding him tightly. "And it's the most beautiful start I've ever seen." That moment, shared between them, symbolized everything they had endured together. Every tear, every struggle, every sacrifice culminated in that quiet triumph. They didn't need to speak. Their shared glance said everything. They both knew what lay ahead, a promising future filled with love, work, and unwavering partnership. As the sun began to set, Brian and Linda stepped outside to join the remaining friends who lingered, chatting and celebrating. They sat side by side, watching the community that had come together to celebrate with them. Brian felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The message of their journey was clear to everyone who had followed their story. Life can knock us down, but with resilience, kindness, and true love, even the cruelest betrayals can be overcome. Brian and Linda were living proof of that, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, together. If this story touched your heart, and you want to keep following inspiring and moving stories, be sure to check out our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content that can brighten your journey and provide valuable insights. Join us and keep exploring stories that truly matter. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now and we'll see you there.